The way I would explain this source is not by starting in Tel Aviv. I would start in Washington, because the most frightening line in the whole document is not simply that a large barrage got through. The most frightening line is that America reached for its familiar toolkit and discovered that none of the options fit cleanly anymore. That, to me, is the real story. A lot of people still think the deepest question in the Middle East is whether Israel can absorb one more war, whether Iran can launch one more wave, whether Hezbollah can keep firing, whether the Gulf can stay stable. Those are all important questions. But this source is asking a different one. What happens when the Central Imperial Power looks at a major regional rupture and finds that each option in its toolbox either escalates the war too far or concedes too much politically? That is where the danger begins. Because once a superpower loses its clean options, the whole region starts learning from that fact. That is why I think this document is best understood as a story of strategic paralysis and regional transition. The source gives us the battlefield first. A synchronized barrage, ballistic missiles from Iran, massive rocket fire from Lebanon, Israeli defenses pressured beyond their design assumptions, interceptor depletion, reload gaps, airfields degraded, ground forces already under stress, a ceasefire request under duress rather than classical surrender. All of that matters because it sets up the second half of the story, the half about Washington. And in Washington, the source says the toolkit did not apply cleanly. That phrase matters so much. Carrier groups could move closer. But at a risk level, naval planners did not consider acceptable under saturation anti-ship missile conditions. Strategic bombers could strike, but such strikes would mean the opening of a broader regional war, not a contained corrective move. Diplomacy existed in principle, but diplomacy after Iran had just demonstrated military superiority of this kind would no longer be diplomacy from a position of American comfort. That is why the document calls the situation strategic paralysis. I think that is the most valuable judgment in the entire piece, because great powers survive many things. What they fear most is the exposure of unusable power, power that exists, but not in the form the moment requires, power that is impressive in inventory, but awkward in application, power that can still destroy but cannot clearly stabilize. That is what the source is describing. And once that kind of paralysis becomes visible, the regional order starts changing very fast. The source makes this explicit by saying the post-1973 regional order rested on two basic guarantees: American military primacy and Israeli military invincibility, or at least decisive superiority. The source argues that both guarantees showed their limits on the same night. That is why this is not merely a battle story. It is an order story. Now let me say something sharper. A strategic order is not maintained only by victory. It is maintained by the belief that when the real test comes, the center still has a clean next move. That is what Washington just lost in this telling. Not every capability, not every ally, not every instrument, but the clean next move. And that is devastating, because once the world senses that the center's next move is always entangled, escalatory, and politically costly, then more actors start updating simultaneously. That is what the second half of the source is really about. Iran updates first. It no longer has to think of itself merely as a spoiler in the source's logic. It has demonstrated itself as the dominant regional military power in operational terms, at least in that moment, because it helped create an outcome where the region's most heavily American equipped military requested a ceasefire under combined assault. That is a huge shift in self-perception. And regional perception, Hezbollah updates too. An actor that can help produce that scale of combined effect in a single operational window is no longer just a proxy irritant in the eyes of regional politics. It becomes a structural fact of Lebanese and wider regional power. The Gulf updates, and I think this part is incredibly important. The source says the Gulf states now have to undertake their most urgent strategic reassessment in decades, because the architecture they built around American protection, just watch those guarantees, fail in real time. That is not merely military fear. It is a crisis of architecture. If you are Saudi Arabia or the UAE and you built so much of your regional assumptions set around American backstopping, then one night like this does not just frighten you, it rewrites your planning horizon. Russia updates, China updates. The source is very explicit there too. Moscow sees validation of the long war logic that Western resources and attention can be stretched and disordered. Beijing sees validation of its broader worldview that American primacy is not permanent, and that multipolar space is opening for actors willing to move patiently. whether one agrees with every tonal flourish in the source. The structural point is obvious. When American paralysis is visible, rival powers learn from it immediately. That is why I say this is not a missile story. It is a learning story. One night can teach more than years of speeches if the lesson is clear enough, and the lesson here is brutally clear. The United States still has power, but power is not the same thing as a usable answer. Now let us talk about energy, because the source S final quarter makes another crucial leap. It says that once Iran's military leverage is demonstrated at this level, every energy actor in the world begins repricing Hormuz risk in a fundamentally different way. Not because Hormuz is newly important. Everyone already knew it was important. The difference is that capability and will have now been displayed in a way that changes the baseline assumptions of insurers, shippers, traders, and importing states. The strait may remain open in formal terms, but formal openness is not the same thing as market confidence. That is a very important observation. A region does not have to be formally closed to become strategically expensive. Sometimes the new order begins the moment risk is repriced. That is what makes multipolar transition so dangerous. It is not simply a matter of flags and speeches. It is a matter of friction entering every transaction, more cost, more insurance, more hesitation, more diplomatic bargaining, more strategic autonomy projects, less casual reliance on old guarantees. That is how a system shifts. Now, I want to stress one thing. This source is clearly dramatic in style, and the claims come from a wartime narrative environment. So a disciplined reader has to separate the rhetorical heat from the strategic skeleton. When I do that, I think the skeleton is still very strong. The skeleton is this. A synchronized Iran-Hezbollah pressure event exposed the limits of Israeli defensive endurance and American clean response options at the same time. That simultaneous exposure matters more than any one casualty figure or one night of television panic. Because once the regional actors see both the local defender and the external guarantor reaching their limits together, the remembered order does not fully survive the demonstration. That is why the source keeps saying the old Middle East is over. I would phrase it a little more carefully myself, but the point is sound. The old Middle East as a structure of unquestioned assumptions is over. The old Middle East as a memory may continue for a while, the institutions may continue, the bases may continue, the alliances may continue, but the assumptions underneath them are no longer automatic. That is the real transformation. And that is why the source ends in the register of multipolarity. The new order, it says, will not be the old order with different actors sitting in the same chairs. It will be an order built around a different distribution of power, a different understanding of risk, and a different acceptance that American structures no longer define every answer by default. That is what it means to say the next Middle East will be more genuinely multipolar. I think that is the right place to end. Not with the image of fire in the sky, but with the image of a toolkit on the table in Washington, all the old tools still there. Carriers, bombers, ultimatums, diplomacy, yet none of them clean, none of them simple, none of them capable of restoring the old order at an acceptable price. That is strategic paralysis. And once strategic paralysis is seen, a region does not simply go back to believing in old guarantees. It starts building around their limits. That is what the source is really telling us. Not just that one side hit hard, but that one night taught the region and the world that American primacy and Israeli invincibility are no longer safe assumptions to build a future on. And when assumptions die, history speeds up.